Uh, First point is the timeline. Uh, Strategy usually addresses 3 years, 5 years, even 10 years, depending on the business we're in. While OKRs have a shorter span, right, or shorter expectation of delivery.
Right.
How do these two things connect or complement each other?
Well, thanks, Guy. Thanks for having me. Um, I think of them as two separate things. I think some people have gotten the idea that OKRs are a way to do strategy, but I think without having a long-term view of where you're trying to go, you may be just kind of flopping around spinelessly. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I see OKRs as a way to execute strategy, but you still need to have a strategy in the first place.
Mhm.
Um, I do think that the idea of what strategy is changing really rapidly. I mean, when you mentioned the 50s, um, a lot of strategic planning came out of the military, for instance, and so there was um, there was an idea with traditional strategic planning that you could project things 3 to 5 years into the future, which is, I think, that's a an epistemological error, you could say, that, like, we think we know what the future will look like because we're going to project past trends into the future. And I think, since we're talking about the 1950s, I know in the American context, yeah, you could be working for General Motors and, you know estimate what the market would be for Chevrolets 3 years into the future, because the economy was growing at a fairly predictable rate. Um, the industries were mature and quite stable that strategic planning was used in, and so that worked up to a point. Um, and it was fine if the senior leaders of the organization understood the strategy, and then they just got everybody else to execute the strategy, to implement the strategy. But everything really started changing once we got into the 1970s and the 80s and 90s, and it just gets faster and more uncertain all the time. So OKRs came out of the environment of Silicon Valley, which, even by the time you got to the late 70s, was extremely competitive. um, Lots of uncertainties in the market, lots of rapid changes in technology, the idea that you could double computing power every 18 months. So it was a very different game than making Chevrolets. But I think at the same time, they are complementary, to answer your question. We see OKRs as a way to implement strategy, but the way we've done strategy in the past, where we went into so much detail about just how many units we'd manufacture and what the cash flow would be, we can't do that. We need a much leaner strategy approach, and it's what I call a minimum viable strategy, to steal a term from agile software development, where we talk about minimum viable product. This is a minimum viable strategy. And then you use OKRs to iterate the strategy and adapt the strategy more rapidly, rather than believing that you know where you're going to be in 5 years.
Yeah. Well, this concept of a minimum viable strategy is pretty interesting. Um, I'd like to ask you to expand on it a little bit more, because what could we consider minimal viable strategy? What elements should be considered in this concept?
Okay, Antonio, can you show that first slide that we talked about, please? So, I mean, the difference with a minimum viable strategy here is that we're trying to just answer a few questions. So you can depict what this strategy looks like on a page or two if you were printing it out. So these are the questions that we're trying to answer. Um, how is the landscape changing? Just in general. Are new competitors entering the market? Are new technologies coming in? What kind of opportunities and disruptions does the future present to us? The second question is, well, against all of that, to filter all of that, well, who are we? Why do we exist? And that's where you get into questions of your long-term mission or purpose, your values and things like that. Now, those things don't change that often. So you may not look at that every year and change it, but those are really foundational to the rest of what you do. But where it starts really getting relevant here is that there are the questions of where to play and how to win. So this was a concept that a great strategist named Roger Martin has come up with, where you basically look at those two things have to fit together. So if you say, well, where to play, that has to do with a lot of traditional market segmentation. What's our target market? Where are they geographically? Where are we in the distribution chain? What is the offer of a product service we make to them? But then when you look at that, then you have to say, well, if that's our choice, how do we win? So what value proposition can we create that will attract and sustain that market? And then what kind of capabilities do we need to do it? So in the process, you might actually go through quite a few combinations of items 3, 4, and 5 here, land on the one that looks the best, and then say, define some North Stars. And this is the way I like to think about what used to be called a strategic vision, because I find a lot of those aren't really actionable. So a North Star is something that is more, it's a big measurable kind of success factor. Like, how are you defining winning the game? So, the biggest selling book on OKRs, of course, is Measure What Matters by John Doerr. And in that book, they talk about how Google, when they bought YouTube, evolved what they wanted that North Star to be. And their first idea was, well, let's just track how many users we have, which is very common in any kind of cloud software sort of implementation. But they started realizing, no, what we really want, we want to make YouTube very compelling for people. So rather than the number of users, we want to know how long are users actually spending on the platform. So they're trying to make sure, well, is YouTube actually compelling? Are we making this a place where people go for entertainment and information? And so they defined the North Star as the number of hours that people were on it. And then they organized everything they did through the organization in order to do that. So these are the elements of a minimum viable strategy. What you'll notice is missing, that you often see in a lot of strategic plans. There's not a long list of initiatives, budgets, 3-year rolling revenue forecasts, none of that kind of stuff, because we're taking a more iterative approach to setting goals and budgeting in this kind of a model.
Okay, so this is a big change for when the company adopts OKR as an enterprise initiative, like as the main way to execute strategy. The plan doesn't come with details, right? You actually just receive directives and a direction to go for, and each one will align, each person or department will align themselves with this macro vision of the company. Is my interpretation correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And the difference is, traditionally, we focused people on output. Like, we want you to, make 20,000 widgets a month, whatever it might be. This is a different kind of thinking. And this is the thing that people find a little hard to get especially when we talk about key results. People think, well, the key result is getting some task done or delivering something. Whereas the outcome, we're really more focused on the value that we're actually creating. And it's hard for people to get their head around that initially, to think that way. So the idea is, we have a better educated workforce than ever, and we want them very engaged in the process. So it makes more sense to say, here's the outcome that we're after. And it's up to you to help figure out how to get there. So that's a big difference. So you don't need all of that detailed planning, because the old idea came out of an old industrial model where, you know, a lot of the workers were not educated, and management assumed, you know, we will tell people what to do, and then we will look at the outcome. But we're trying to spread this outcome thinking further into the organization, and encourage and empower people to make more of their own decisions and follow through on their own commitments.
In this autonomous model, how do you assure that the sum of everybody's objectives and key results will lead to the strategy? I mean, is it enough? Is it sufficient to execute the strategy? How do you connect that?
Well, I think first off, you have to make sure that people understand what the strategy is, which is why I think it's very important that the strategy be minimal, you know, that you should be able to, communicate that, and people should get what it is. Because what I've found, I mean, I've been doing strategic planning a lot longer than I've been using OKRs. And, you know, forever I've seen that the problem most organizations have is that the understanding of the strategy decays rapidly the further you get from the executive suite. And often a lot of it may be in one leader's head. And there's the attitude that we'll communicate this. I mean, a term I really came to hate earlier in my career working in big organizations was need to know basis. So we'll look, Guy, we'll just tell you what you need to know when you need to know it. You know, so we don't want you to have the big picture of what's going on. We'll just tell you what to do when the time comes. So you just wait for that. That doesn't work in this kind of a model. So you have to communicate, over communicate what you're doing to people. And this is, you know, I think the newer generations of management, we see this happening already with the idea they do need to understand it. So that's an absolute prerequisite for people setting the OKRs, because they need to have a conversation on their particular team about how do we understand what the strategy is, and then how does our team actually contribute to that? How might we do that? And so then you tell them what the strategy is, you bring in the grammar or the language of OKRs and say, okay, write some OKRs. Now, you still need to talk about that through the whole organization such that there's transparency. You know, that's definitely one of the superpowers of OKRs. There's transparency. So it isn't a free-for-all. You know, the leaders at all levels need to understand what the OKRs that are bubbling up beneath them. And depending on the kind of organization that you've got, you might have a budget for like how many OKRs directly support things that are at the top of the organization versus which ones are bubbling up from underneath. So let's just say we start off and we say, well, it's 50-50. So if a team has two OKRs, one of them ought to support, you know, there's like 4 big OKRs at the company level, and here's the one that we can support the best. But we also have issues of our own. So one example I've used a lot, I worked with a wellness resort in the Caribbean. So it's on an island. They have a great workforce for people who are in the direct guest service areas, you know, housekeeping and food and beverage. They're absolutely great. It's a really good job to have there. But they were really having a hard time finding technical people to do digital marketing for them. And this was a few years ago, so admittedly a dated example, but it's a small island, and you don't have schools that teach people to do digital marketing. Those are really rare skills. And so that department had an objective to increase the attractiveness of the jobs, you know, increase the retention of people in the job. But that was a unique problem to that department. So that's the example of bottom up. complementing top down. And so depending on the team you're in, you may, the amount may vary, like the classic example from Google in the software engineering department was 2/3 of the OKRs were bottom up because, they were trying to use the cache they were generating from search in order to come up with new ideas. And that's been very successful. That's how they came up with Gmail and so many other great products we all use that they've come up with. So you want that mix in order to engage people so they don't feel like we're not just serving these large abstract strategic objectives, we're also trying to make our own job better and finding the balance.
And you touched on a point that is also a question for me, that is, how can we connect this with corporate budget, right? Because OKRs are very dynamic, right? They usually have a time span of 3 months and roll 4 times a year, right? And the initiatives, the effort needed to execute or reach the key results, you'll need resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to run a budget, especially in big corporations, is something very time consuming and effort intensive, right?
Right.
How do you connect this agile structure of OKRs of, every 3 months coming up with new objectives, new initiatives, with having the money ready to support these key results?
Right. That's a great question. And I have to say, I don't think many organizations have been very progressive about thinking about budgeting. There's a whole movement in Europe called Beyond Budgeting, which I think is a great idea, where the idea is that they do typically a 6-quarter rolling forecast and develop notional budgets based on that. But the thing is it can be adapted. Like every quarter you're reviewing what you're doing 6 months ahead. Now this just has not caught on at all in North America, and I don't understand why. I'm not a finance person. I don't understand what the problem is, but I think what people who have studied the larger question of how does the whole organization become agile say that resource fluidity is really important. So because so many organizations, you're right, they have all of this money locked up in different little cost centers, and the managers of those cost centers feel like, well, that's my budget, don't take my budget away from me, instead of getting focused more on common purpose. So I've seen some progress in the software development world where they'll do value stream budgeting. Like if you look at the Scaled Agile framework, that's an element that they talk about in there. I haven't seen that applied as much as it could be to other functions in the organization, though. So I think it's a frontier. I think it's an area where we can make more progress.
Right. It's something in development right now, then. Another topic I wanted to ask you about is about coexistence of methodologies, right? So in the beginning of your talk, you talked about like OKRs were originated in Silicon Valley with tech companies, very agile, very dynamic market. In contrast with what the origin of long-term strategy, army or armed forces or car manufacturers. But we still manufacture cars today, right?
Yeah,
and a car is not a software. So, and even in big companies, tech companies like Intel or NVIDIA or even Google, you have stable processes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You
Right.
have to manufacture the chip,
Right.
How and then how can these two worlds that many times exist within the same company, right? Coexist because they have different needs, different demands. And there are methodologies like balanced scorecard or management by objectives like MBOs, or even just managing KPIs for performance, right? And structured project management, PMI style, with Gantt graphs and critical paths and all that. All of this has its application still today, right? Given the different processes that exist in each company and the different cultures of company, different markets where they're inserted into. So
yeah,
how do you see the coexistence of OKRs with these different practices like balanced scorecards and MBOs?
Okay. Yeah, and like the question you're asking to me is really on two levels. Like to me, balanced scorecard, OKRs, and MBOs are all about strategic goals, which is, you're here and you're trying to get here. The issue of KPIs versus OKRs or any of those other models is kind of one of what's operational versus what is strategic. So I'm going to just treat those as two separate questions. So slide 3, Antonio. So let's talk about that, because there's been an evolution. Like MBO, management by objectives, came about in the 1950s from Peter Drucker, because he was trying to get away from that old industrial model and say, now we have a lot of knowledge workers, and so they need to be involved in setting their own goals and understanding how they're contributing, rather than just being told, like, move this pile of iron ore from here to over here. So management by objectives was very top down, and it tended to only focus on the individual manager. So this is a model that's been around for a long time. When I started my career, I was in a training function, and this is what we were teaching people to do. So the idea there was that you'd set annual objectives. They were tied to compensation. If you achieve your objective, you should get a bonus. And it basically cascaded down through the management hierarchy, through the organization. So the intent of it was to ensure that everyone was complying with what the overall strategy was. Now, what Andy Grove did at Intel, which actually led to objectives and key results, and I'll come back to balanced scorecard, was he said, well, what we're doing is so complicated that even if I am the CEO, I don't understand what a lot of the engineers are working on. So it can't be entirely top down. They have to tell me what they need too. It has to be a two-way conversation. And that's what I talked about earlier, the mix between top down and bottom up. So we need to involve more people in it. It isn't just management, it's also engineering as well. And so because we're doing things that are very risky and we're in an uncertain market, we'll have a loose coupling to compensation, but not an exact one, because we can't predict all the factors that'll lead to success or not. And that's where you started to get more of an idea of stretch goals. So objectives and key results is a good technique to use if you're trying to achieve stretch goals and involve the whole workforce in it. That's the big difference. In the meantime, we had this thing called balanced scorecard, which I worked with for years, which that came out of the late 80s, early 90s, Fortune 500 environment. And so that is, as you mentioned, Guy, if you're in a relatively stable situation and you're trying to just, improve your position within that, balanced scorecard is great. The thing that's great with balanced scorecard is it's designed to be comprehensive. You have goals that address financial performance, performance vis-a-vis your customer, the productivity and the culture and the learning of the people that work in your organization and process improvement and technology and all of that. So each of those perspectives may have some goals. So I really loved working with that model for years because it was so holistic that way. And you can apply that model to objectives and key results. So in some organizations, we'll see that the organization as a whole might have a balanced scorecard, and the areas that need to move faster, like product development, might use OKRs, but you might not need OKRs in some other kinds of functions that are more stable. So maybe, can we look at the next slide? I'll just illustrate this point, because what I discovered in the research I did for my book was that Google itself, since everybody reads about how successful Google was and we want to emulate Google, you can't do that because they don't imitate themselves. They use OKRs where they need to use OKRs. So I talked to someone who was involved in facilities. So that's an example you were talking about, Guy, of a kind of function that maybe doesn't need OKRs because they're running a bus system to, come into San Francisco and pick up employees. That's a key performance indicator. Are the buses on time? Do the buses have enough capacity? So you're just constantly trying to manage to that rather than doing something dramatically new. So in this model, this is something I borrowed from McKinsey, and these are 3 different strategy horizons. So in the one where you're doing business as usual, keeping the lights on, you're going to use KPIs in that kind of context. If you've got a relatively stable business, but let's say, you're active in the state of Nebraska, but you want to move into Kansas, well, that's incremental growth. Like you're going to offer the same product to the same kind of people, but you're growing. So that's horizon 2. You may not have revenue from that yet. So that's where we start using OKRs. But that might be what you call a committed OKR. Like we're very clear, we know how to open a new McDonald's in a new neighborhood. So it's just a matter of buckling down and doing it. Whereas the real stretch goals, where you get these big OKR stories, tend to be more in horizon 3, where you're actually innovating an entire new service and value. But all of these things are actually equally important. And that's a challenge we often see when we're brought in to work with OKRs, because I think you have to honor the kind of work that keeps the lights on, right? That's something we all learned during the pandemic, that, the people that work in those grocery stores, the people who pick up the trash they're as important as any of us to keep society, to keep all of us harmoniously working together. So all of these things need to be there. Like it's not all, the glory of brand new products.
Yeah. So on these 2 levels that you separated, balanced scorecard or MBOs and OKRs, they actually complement each other, right?
They do. We could go back, Antonio. They do, because I think the balanced scorecard came out of, large, complex organizations who were mostly in a relatively stable market and needing to do things like, what you do strategically in that case is you're trying to improve margins. You're not reinventing the wheel by any means. You're trying to make the wheel more efficient. So back in the 90s, when I started my career in consulting, we were talking about, process reengineering. So we weren't challenging what we were in business to do. We were just finding a way to be much more efficient in delivering it. That was the name of the game in those days. Objectives and key results came out of Silicon Valley, where you're inventing entire new products that we didn't even know we need. Like, here's my iPhone. And in 2007, when that was introduced, I didn't know that I needed one little thing. Like if you'd asked me, well, like the whole joke is Henry Ford, 100 years ago, Ford Motor Company said, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said, give me a faster horse, because that's all they had in mind. He reinvented transportation by making cars, which were a luxury item up until then, available to average people. So yeah, if you're in a more stable environment, balanced scorecard is fine. Balanced scorecard can be great to define the overall organization. It depends on operational tempo. So and you know, from a data software point of view, all of these systems have the same what I would call molecular structure, in that you have an objective, and then you have ways you're measuring the attainment of the objective. We had that in balanced scorecard, we had that in MBO, and we have that in OKRs. It's just a question of how fast are we moving and how uncertain are we? And that would determine which one of these you'd use.
The DNA thread behind each of these is the same, right?
Right, absolutely.
And, on the other level that you commented on, KPIs and OKRs, do you usually see the departments adopting one or another? So if it's a more stable process, that will go for KPIs. If it requires more innovation, or you know you have more uncertainty of where you're gonna go, you adopt OKRs. Or do you see them also mixing and being used or coexisting in the departmental scope of application?
You mean like in the same department?
In the same department, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because that's that horizon one. There are things you just absolutely have to do to keep working. And I think that's been one of the misconceptions in OKRs. Because one anti-pattern I see is people go in and say they want to come up with OKRs for everything. And you don't need OKRs for everything. Some things you need KPIs for, and you can't take your eye off that ball. So no, you're absolutely right.
Many, I mean, even though OKRs has been around for a few years now, many companies are still starting to adopt it, or are interested in adopting it, but hasn't taken the first steps yet. What are the first, how to begin, right, using OKR in your organization?
Well, I think two things, at least two things. I mean, one of them is you do need to be clear on your strategy. Like, where are you trying to go? Because I've had some people contact me, they want to work with OKRs, but they don't have a clear shared idea of what they want to do differently than what they're doing now. In which case, don't talk about OKRs. So it's like you need to have some vision of where you're trying to go. Absolutely. And we can help clarify what that vision is, but you need something like that in order to do that. So that's the minimum viable strategy piece, I think, just to give everybody an anchor. The second thing I think would be just giving people adequate training to understand that this is in many ways a new language and a new way of thinking about goals. It requires outcome thinking, like we talked about at the beginning, and regular conversations to check in and see how we're doing. So I think the training and understanding how to manage it on an ongoing basis is really, and making a commitment to that is really important.
Yeah, great. And when you say to have a vision or a minimal viable strategy, my understanding is that it's not more of the same. It's not like I'm gonna do the same I do now, but more. It's that just requires replication, right? When you say to have a clear vision of where you want to go, is and that is a prerequisite to start working with OKRs. But I'm trying to understand here. The vision must, in this case, should be not just grow today's operation, but create new things, address
Right,
new
right.
markets, new products, right?
You've got it. It's creating new value in the world. And I mean, it's great you bring that up, because it's like, becoming more profitable is not a very interesting objective. I think it's a very valid key result, but not the objective. The objective needs to be more inspiring than that. We're going to create a whole new, just to pick on YouTube. I'm a big fan and user of YouTube. We're creating a whole new video environment, that enables people to share things with other people, to find all kinds of entertainment that's outside of what's controlled by cable and the regular networks and all that kind of thing. So it's focused on the customer. I mean, it's the same idea with any kind of digital transformation we're talking about. It's about staying focused on the value to the customer and thinking about that outcome, and then orienting your actions around that.
How do you motivate or align people's efforts with these objectives? In the MBO model or column you showed, you had like the objectives aligned with incentives, with bonuses, right?
Right,
And
right.
that's a fairly straightforward way to get people motivated to reach those goals and implement those objectives, right? I know that OKRs do not work that way. And you, on your slide, you had that it's more of a loose connection or something
Right.
in that sense. So the question is, again, do these two things work in parallel? And the second question would be two things. I mean, incentives, to have a structure, bonus structure, and a way to motivate or incentivize people into alignment. And the second question is, if OKR does not work in that way, because it can distort the objectives and the
Right.
like the moonshots, right?
Right.
How do you get people motivated and aligned with these objectives?
Right. Right. Great question. Well, and as you're referring to, I think if you tied bonuses really, or salary increases very directly to OKRs, what the natural human thing to do is to create very safe goals, right? Oh, I know I can do this. So we call that sandbagging. You're just building a defense, like with sandbags. So when we talk about loosely coupled, what it really means is we emphasize that OKRs are a team sport. And the way that a person as a team member works with OKRs, I think, is a fair thing to evaluate as part of a performance appraisal. It's part of being a good team player. And I think it's fair to evaluate people on whether they're good team players. And OKRs, when done right, are a great way to encourage this kind of team play. You don't, though, want to tie the salary directly to the accomplishment of the key results in most cases, because then people will set really safe targets. So I hope that makes sense to everybody on the call, that there are some exceptions. I think in the case of really senior management, like it or not, you are responsible for achieving the big stretch goals of the company. That's why senior executives get paid more. They're taking on much more responsibility and much more risk. So I think them, and then I think certain commission salespeople, I think it actually makes sense for them. But those two categories, to me, are the exception that proves the rule. The great mass of people should not be, they should be held responsible for how they participate in the OKR process, not for the results. And I hope that makes sense to everybody.
Yeah, to do a recognition based on contribution and effort, not necessarily the delivery, because the delivery, it's uncertain times and certain projects, right?
Exactly.
But for top level and sales, you think bonuses still are make sense, right?
Right, because I can't imagine going into a board meeting, you know, in a for-profit company and saying like, you know, don't do that. I don't think they just wouldn't go along with me if I said that. That's just not at that level in the economy. That's just not the way things work.
And they look at the bottom line. So the bonuses must be aligned to the bottom line that in ultimate analysis will be the deliverable, right?
Absolutely. That's the way it works.